At the Big Mountain Haven, a nonprofit sanctuary run by a couple dedicated to caring for native wildlife, including injured or orphaned animals unable to return to their natural habitat. Rafis, a full-grown bobcat with distinctive tufted ears and powerful limbs, who seemed to forget he was a wild predator. Instead, he claims the worn leather couch as his personal throne, watching television with a tilted head and greeting familiar visitors with casual confidence. Rafis was rescued at just 8 months old, scared and fragile, after being found orphaned and struggling to survive on his own. For 3 years, this 30-pound predator has made himself at home, claiming the warmest spots in their living room and watching TV with fully at ease in the home. But when a stern wildlife officer arrives for an inspection, everything changes. The officer declares, her clipboard filled with damning notes. It's unnatural and potentially dangerous. And when the final decision comes, will this bobcat be torn from the only home he's ever truly known?
He's really just a part of the family.
This is the story of a bobcat who blurred the lines between wild and tame, and the fight to protect a bond that defied expectations. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The morning frost sparkled across the Montana meadow like scattered diamonds as Sarah Gallagher stepped onto the porch of the rustic log cabin that served as both her family home and the administrative office of the Big Mountain Haven. Steam rose from her coffee mug, disappearing into the crisp autumn air as her eyes traced the distant tree line where the sun was just beginning to crest the mountains. At 58, Sarah's weathered face bore the gentle lines of someone who had spent a lifetime outdoors, but her eyes remained bright with purpose. Morning came quick today, her husband Tom called from inside, his voice carrying through the screen door. At 62, Tom Gallagher still moved with the deliberate strength of the forest ranger he'd been for 30 years before they decided to create this sanctuary for injured and orphaned wildlife. It always does, Sarah replied, taking a final sip before heading back inside. Especially when you've got a bobcat who thinks he owns your living room. The interior of their cabin was a curious blend of rustic functionality and wildlife rehabilitation equipment. The main room housed their personal furniture alongside a specially built enclosure that connected to a larger outdoor habitat. Their home serving as a transition point between wild and tame for many of their rescues. Veterinary supplies were neatly organized on shelves, and educational materials were stacked on a desk in the corner where Sarah managed the nonprofit's administrative needs. But what caught anyone's attention first was the sight of Rafis, a full-grown male bobcat, curled comfortably on their worn leather couch as though it had been designed specifically for him. "He's been waiting for you to go outside so he could claim your spot," Tom chuckled, flipping a pancake on the cast-iron griddle. "I swear he understands the concept of warm seat." Sarah smiled, setting her mug on the counter and approaching the couch. At nearly 30 pounds with distinctive tufted ears and the characteristic spotted tan coat of a bobcat, Rafis looked every bit the wild predator he was genetically programmed to be. But instead of growling or retreating as she approached, he simply yawned, stretched his powerful limbs, and blinked lazily at her. "Good morning to you too, Your Majesty," she said softly, running a practiced hand along his back. The bobcat responded with a sound somewhere between a purr and a chuff, a vocalization reserved only for the Gallaghers. 3 years earlier, Rafis had been nothing but a frightened, malnourished kitten, barely 8 months old and clinging to life. Now he was the unofficial mascot of the Big Mountain Haven, a sanctuary nestled in the foothills of northwestern Montana dedicated to rehabilitating native wildlife. Most of their rescues eventually returned to the wild, but Rafis was among the permanent residents, animals whose circumstances meant they would never survive independently in their natural habitat. As Sarah scratched behind Rafis's ears, she thought back to the day that had changed both their lives forever. It had been an unusually harsh winter 3 years ago. February had brought record snowfall and temperatures that plummeted far below zero for weeks on end. Wildlife conservation officers had found the young bobcat huddled beneath an abandoned hunting cabin, severely malnourished and suffering from frostbite on one paw. His mother was nowhere to be found, likely fallen victim to a poacher, as illegal hunting had been on the rise that season. When the officers contacted the Big Mountain Haven, Sarah and Tom had been in the middle of trying to save 3 orphaned wolf pups whose pack had been decimated by the same brutal winter. Resources were stretched thin, but turning away an animal in need wasn't in their nature. "We'll make room," Sarah had told the conservation officer over the phone, even as Tom gave her a worried look. Their small operation ran entirely on donations and their personal savings from decades of government service. Each new rescue meant more expenses, more work, and more heartache if things didn't go well. When the young bobcat arrived, he was little more than bones and matted fur, with dull eyes that held none of the fierce wildness that should have been there. Tom had prepared a heated enclosure in their medical treatment room, expecting the typical response of a wild predator: hissing, spitting, and desperate attempts to escape human contact. Instead, the kitten had been too weak to resist as their volunteer veterinarian, Dr. Elena Martinez, carefully examined him. "He's severely dehydrated," Elena had said, gently checking the bobcat's gums. "And there's significant infection in that right front paw. He wouldn't have lasted another day out there." "What are his chances?" Tom had asked, already mentally calculating the additional expense of antibiotics and specialized care. Elena had hesitated before answering. 50-50 at best. But there's something else you should know. He's been handled by humans before. Sarah had frowned. "You think someone tried to keep him as a pet?" "It's becoming more common," Elena sighed. "People find orphaned wild animals and think they're doing good by raising them, but they don't know what they're doing. Then when the cute kitten starts becoming a wild predator, they abandon them. Based on how he's responding to handling, I'd say someone had him for at least a couple months before turning him loose." The news had filled Sarah with a familiar anger. 20 years working for the Forest Service had shown her countless examples of human carelessness toward wildlife. "Let's give him a name," Tom had suggested, already reaching for the bottle of specialized formula they used for orphaned predators. "Might as well make him feel welcome for however long he's with us." Sarah had studied the bobcat's face, noting a distinctive dark rufous streak running across his right cheek. Rafis, she decided. It suits him. Those first weeks had been touch and go. Rafis required round-the-clock care, with bottle feedings every 3 hours. The infection in his paw responded slowly to antibiotics, and there were nights when Sarah and Tom took turns sitting up with him, fearing he wouldn't make it until morning. "I don't think he's going to pull through," Tom had said one particularly difficult night, as Rafis lay limp and unresponsive on a heating pad in their treatment room. But Sarah had always been the stubborn one in their 40 years together. "He just needs something to fight for," she'd insisted, carefully administering another dose of medication. Sometimes they need to know someone believes in them. Whether it was the medication, Sarah's determination, or some inner resilience they hadn't recognized, Rafis had begun improving the very next day. His appetite returned, followed by alertness, and finally, the playfulness that marked juvenile predators' learning skills they would need for survival. By spring, his physical recovery was remarkable. The frostbitten paw had healed, though he would always have a slight limp. His coat had grown in glossy and full, and his once skinny frame had developed the powerful muscles characteristic of his species. In appearance, he was becoming a magnificent example of a North American bobcat. But something was different about Rafis. While Elena worked with them to minimize human imprinting with their other rescues, it quickly became apparent that Rafis's early experience with humans had permanently altered his relationship with his own kind. When they'd attempted to introduce him to another rescued bobcat, a female of similar age who was successfully being rehabilitated for eventual release, Rafis had shown no interest in her. Instead, he'd repeatedly sought out human company, displaying none of the natural wariness that would be essential for his survival in the wild. The decision to classify him as a permanent resident hadn't been made lightly. Sarah, Tom, and Elena had spent countless hours discussing his case, consulting with wildlife rehabilitation experts across the country, and even bringing in a specialist from the University of Montana's Wildlife Biology Department. "He's what we call irrevocably imprinted," Dr. James Wilson, the specialist, had explained after observing Rafis for several days. The critical period for learning natural bobcat behavior was disrupted by human contact. Releasing him would be a death sentence. He lacks the hunting skills, the natural caution around humans, and the territorial behaviors he needs. Not to mention, he could potentially disrupt wild bobcat populations if he does manage to survive. Sarah had nodded, unsurprised but still saddened by the confirmation of what they'd already suspected. "So he stays with us." "He stays, Doctor," Wilson had agreed. "But I have to warn you. Keeping a wild predator, even an imprinted one, as essentially a pet comes with challenges. Bobcats retain their instincts even when raised by humans. He'll become more territorial as he matures, may mark areas with scent, and could develop aggressive behaviors." None of those warnings had deterred the Gallaghers. By then, Rafis had already claimed a piece of their hearts, along with a corner of their home. They'd constructed a specialized enclosure that connected to their living area, giving him the option to move between a natural outdoor habitat and their home. As federally licensed wildlife rehabilitators with decades of experience, they were uniquely qualified to provide Rafis with the specialized care he required. What none of them had anticipated was Rafis's peculiar fascination with their couch. "Earth to Sarah," Tom called, pulling her back to the present. "Pancakes are getting cold." Sarah blinked, realizing she'd been lost in memories while still absently stroking Rafis's fur. The bobcat had fallen back asleep under her hand, his powerful chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. "Sorry," she smiled, giving Rafis a final pat before joining Tom at the table. "Just thinking about how far we've come." Tom nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The Big Mountain Haven had grown from a personal dream into a recognized wildlife rehabilitation center, now hosting educational tours and working closely with state and federal wildlife agencies. They'd expanded from their original cabin to include several specialized enclosures, a proper medical facility, and even modest accommodations for their small team of dedicated volunteers. But through all the growth and changes, Rafis had remained constant, their first permanent resident and the unexpected face of their mission. "We've got the school group coming at 11, Tom reminded her, pouring maple syrup over his stack of pancakes. "Fifth graders from Whitefish Elementary." "Think we should put Rafis in his outdoor enclosure for that?" Sarah asked, knowing how excited children could become around the animals. He wasn't too happy with the last group. Tom considered this as he chewed. Maybe. But remember how he won over that senator's aide last month? Having her see him lounging on the couch like a house cat is what got us that extra funding consideration. Sarah smiled, remembering how the initially skeptical political aide had been completely charmed by Rafis's domestic behavior. The sight of a full-grown bobcat watching television with his head tilted had done more for their fundraising efforts than any formal presentation ever could. Their breakfast was interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel, their morning volunteer arriving to help with feeding the other animals. Currently, the sanctuary housed 2 rehabilitating bald eagles, a one-eyed great horned owl, a family of raccoons, and a black bear cub that had been orphaned in the spring. Each required specialized care, carefully designed to maintain their wild nature while supporting their recovery. "I'll go help Melissa with the morning rounds," Tom said, rising from the table and carrying his empty plate to the sink. "You finish up the grant application?" "Almost done," Sarah nodded. "Just need to add the final budget numbers." Tom paused at the door, looking back at Rafus still curled contentedly on their couch. "You know, for all the worrying Dr. Wilson did about him becoming aggressive as he matured, he's turned out to be the gentlest soul we've had here." Sarah followed his gaze, feeling the familiar surge of protectiveness. He just needed the right place to belong. As Tom headed out to greet their volunteer, Sarah moved to her desk and opened her laptop. The grant application for expanded educational programming stared back at her, demanding attention. But her eyes kept drifting to the sleeping bobcat. Rafus had become more than just a resident of their sanctuary. He was living proof of their philosophy that every animal deserved compassion, even those that couldn't return to the wild. The sound of her phone ringing pulled her attention away. The caller ID showed Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, their primary partner agency for wildlife rescues. "Sarah Gallagher," she answered, already reaching for a notepad. "Sarah, it's Mark Davis," came the familiar voice of the regional wildlife manager. "We've got a situation I wanted to discuss with you before it goes any further." Something in his tone made Sarah sit up straighter. "What kind of situation?" Mark hesitated before continuing. "There's been a complaint filed about your facility, specifically about Rafus." Sarah's stomach tightened. "A complaint? From whom?" "A new conservation officer transferred in from Wyoming last month. She visited your public tour last week and has concerns about Rafus's living arrangement. Says it's improper habituation and against rehabilitation best practices." "But Rafus isn't being rehabilitated for release," Sarah protested, her voice rising enough that the bobcat's ears twitched in his sleep. "He's a permanent resident because he can't survive in the wild. That's all documented in his case file." "I know that, Sarah," Mark said soothingly. "But Officer Reynolds is pushing for a formal review. She's suggesting Rafus should be transferred to a more traditional wildlife facility where he would have less human contact." The thought of Rafus being taken away sent a chill through Sarah. While she understood the theoretical argument, many wildlife professionals believed even permanently captive animals should be kept as wild as possible. She knew Rafus would be devastated by such a change. His unique circumstances and early imprinting had created an animal that genuinely thrived on human interaction. "Mark, you've seen him yourself. He seeks out human contact. Forcing him away from that now would be cruel." "I agree with you," Mark assured her. "But I wanted to give you a heads up. There's going to be an inspection next week. Officer Reynolds will be accompanied by Dr. Karen West from the State Veterinary Board. They'll evaluate all your residents, but I know the primary focus will be Rafus." After arranging the details of the inspection and thanking Mark for the warning, Sarah hung up and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. The big mountain haven operated with all the proper permits and followed approved protocols for wildlife rehabilitation. But Rafus's situation was admittedly unusual. Most facilities maintained clearer boundaries between the human caregivers and the animals, even permanent residents. The sound of movement drew her attention back to the couch, where Rafus was now stretching luxuriously, his powerful limbs extending to their full length, before he settled back into a comfortable lounge position, one paw dangling casually over the edge of the cushion. There was something so trusting in his posture, so completely at ease in his surroundings. The thought of disrupting that trust made Sarah's chest ache. Tom returned from the morning feeding rounds to find Sarah still staring at Rafus, the grant application forgotten on her computer screen. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, recognizing the worry in her expression. As Sarah explained the situation, Tom's face darkened. "They can't just take him," he said firmly. "We have all the proper permits." "They could revoke those permits if they decide we're not following proper protocols," Sarah said quietly. "And technically, there are guidelines about minimizing habituation, even for permanent residents." "But every animal is different," Tom argued. "Rafis was humanized before he ever came to us. Forcing him into isolation now would be cruel." Sarah nodded, reaching for her phone again. "I'm calling Elena. We need to get ahead of this." Dr. Elena Martinez had been their volunteer veterinarian since the beginning, driving the 40 minutes from her small-town practice twice a week to check on the animals at the sanctuary. As a board-certified wildlife veterinarian, her opinion carried weight with state authorities. When Elena arrived later that afternoon, she found Sarah and Tom sitting on their porch, deep in conversation about strategy for the upcoming inspection. Rafis had moved to his outdoor enclosure, where he was sprawled on a large flat rock soaking up the autumn sunshine. "So let me get this straight," Elena said after hearing the situation. "Some new officer thinks Rafis shouldn't be allowed on your couch?" "Essentially," Sarah nodded. "She believes we're causing improper habituation." Elena snorted, her dark eyes flashing with annoyance. Has she bothered to read his case file? The poor creature was already habituated before you got him. You two saved his life. "The inspection team will include Dr. West from the State Vet Board," Tom added. "We're more concerned about her assessment." Elena's expression softened. "Karen's fair. I've worked with her on several cases. She understands that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to wildlife rehabilitation." "But will she understand Rafis?" Sarah asked, watching as the bobcat rolled onto his back, exposing his belly to the warm sun, a position of vulnerability that wild bobcats rarely displayed. "Let me examine him today," Elena suggested. "I'll update his medical records with my latest observations on his physical and psychological well-being. Having fresh documentation about how he's thriving in this environment will help." As they watched Elena conduct her examination of Rafis in his outdoor enclosure, Tom wrapped an arm around Sarah's shoulders. "Remember when we thought he wouldn't make it through that first night?" Sarah leaned into her husband's embrace. "And now we're fighting to keep him with us." "He belongs here," Tom said simply. Anyone who spends 5 minutes watching him would understand that. But as the day of the inspection approached, Sarah's anxiety grew. She'd spent hours organizing their records, preparing documentation about Rafis's unique case, and even reaching out to Dr. Wilson at the university for a supporting statement about the appropriateness of Rafis's living arrangement. The morning of the inspection dawned clear and cold. Sarah had barely slept, and even Tom's usually unshakable confidence seemed diminished as they prepared the sanctuary for scrutiny. They had decided to keep Rafis in his outdoor enclosure initially, wanting the inspection team to see that he did have appropriate space and enrichment for a bobcat. "Should we warn the volunteers not to mention his evening TV habits?" Tom asked as they did a final walkthrough of the facilities. Sarah shook her head. I don't want to be caught in a lie. Rafis is who he is, and we've never hidden how we care for him. We'll just have to make them understand." Officer Jeanette Reynolds arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, accompanied by Dr. Karen West. Reynolds was younger than Sarah had expected, perhaps in her early 30s, with her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and a clipboard clutched tightly in one hand. Dr. West was older, with silver-streaked hair and the calm demeanor of someone who had seen it all in her years of veterinary practice. "Mrs. Gallagher," Officer Reynolds began formally, "we're here to conduct a comprehensive inspection of your facility, with particular attention to the rehabilitation protocols for permanent residents." "Of course," Sarah replied, keeping her voice even. "We've prepared all our documentation for review, and you're welcome to examine any part of our operation." The inspection began with a review of their permits and medical records. Dr. West asked detailed questions about their feeding protocols, enrichment activities, and veterinary care. To Sarah's relief, she seemed impressed with the thoroughness of their record-keeping and the cleanliness of their facilities. Officer Reynolds, however, remained stern, making notes on her clipboard without revealing her thoughts. When they reached Rafis's outdoor enclosure, her frown deepened. The bobcat was perched on a high platform, watching their approach with obvious interest rather than the wariness a wild bobcat would display. When Sarah called his name softly, he immediately stood, stretching before making his way down to the ground level of the enclosure. "As you can see," Sarah explained, "Rafis has a naturalistic habitat with appropriate climbing structures, hiding places, and enrichment items." She pointed out the various features they had designed specifically for him, including a small pond, logs for scratching, and platforms at different heights. "Yet I understand he spends significant time inside your home," Officer Reynolds stated, her tone making it clear she considered this inappropriate. "Rafis was severely imprinted on humans before he came to us," Tom explained. Dr. Wilson from the University of Montana's Wildlife Biology Department determined that forcing him to live as a wild bobcat would actually be detrimental to his welfare. Dr. West crouched near the enclosure, observing Rafis thoughtfully. "His physical condition appears excellent," she noted. "Good muscle tone, clear eyes, healthy coat." "That's because he's happy," Sarah said simply. "He has the best of both worlds, natural space out here, and the human connection he craves." Officer Reynolds made another note on her clipboard. "I'd like to see the interior arrangement you've mentioned in your reports." Sarah exchanged a glance with Tom before leading the inspection team back toward their cabin. As they approached, Rafis followed along the length of his enclosure, clearly anticipating being allowed inside. "We have a specialized door system," Sarah explained, showing how the secure passage connected Rafis's outdoor space to a designated area within their home. "He can come in during supervised periods, but always has access back to his outdoor enclosure." "And this is where the couch is located?" Officer Reynolds asked, her tone making the word sound like something inappropriate. "Yes," Sarah admitted. "Rafis has shown a particular preference for our couch. It's become part of his routine and comfort." Inside, the inspection team examined the interior setup. Sarah demonstrated how Rafis would be allowed in, and on cue, the bobcat entered cautiously, clearly aware of the strangers in his space. But his familiarity with routine overcame his wariness, and within moments, he had claimed his usual spot on the worn leather couch. Officer Reynolds' eyebrows shot up as Rafis settled himself, tucking his paws beneath him and watching the proceedings with casual interest. "This is exactly the type of inappropriate habituation I was concerned about," she stated. "This animal is displaying behaviors entirely inconsistent with his species." "With respect, Officer Reynolds," Dr. West interjected, "this animal's natural development was disrupted long before he arrived here. The Gallaghers have simply provided an environment that accommodates his unique needs. Our primary concern is his welfare," Sarah added. "Rafis thrives with this arrangement. He's healthy, engaged, and shows no signs of stress." "He's a wild animal being treated like a house cat," Officer Reynolds countered. "It's unnatural and potentially dangerous." As if on cue, the cabin door opened and Melissa, their young volunteer, entered with a stack of educational materials for the afternoon tour. Seeing the gathering in the living room, she froze momentarily before recovering her composure. "Sorry to interrupt," she began, but was cut off by a blur of movement as Rafis suddenly leapt from the couch and bounded across the room toward her. Officer Reynolds gasped, clearly expecting an attack, but to everyone's surprise, Rafis simply circled Melissa's legs once before returning to the couch, this time positioning himself to keep all the humans in his line of sight. He always does that, Melissa explained with a smile. It's like his way of saying hello to people he knows. Sarah could see Officer Reynolds making more notes, her expression unreadable. The inspection continued for another hour, with Dr. West conducting a brief physical examination of Rafus, while Officer Reynolds documented every aspect of their setup. Finally, the two stepped outside for a private consultation. Through the window, Sarah could see them engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion, with Dr. West gesturing emphatically while Officer Reynolds shook her head. "This doesn't look good," Tom murmured, standing beside Sarah at the window. When the inspection team returned, Officer Reynolds' expression remained stern, but Dr. West was smiling slightly. "Mrs. Gallagher, Mr. Gallagher," Dr. West began. "After reviewing your facility and discussing Rafus's unique circumstances, I've made my recommendation to Fish, Wildlife, and Parks." Sarah held her breath, feeling Tom's hand tighten around hers. While Officer Reynolds has valid concerns about habituation practices in general, Dr. West continued, "I believe Rafus represents a special case. His physical and behavioral health appear excellent under your care, and the documentation from Dr. Wilson and Dr. Martinez supports the appropriateness of your approach for this particular animal." Officer Reynolds cleared her throat. "I still have reservations about the level of human interaction, particularly the furniture access," she said stiffly. "However, Dr. West's assessment carries significant weight, and your documentation is comprehensive." "Our recommendation, Doctor," West said, "will be to approve the continuation of your current practices for Rafus, with the condition that you document any changes in his behavior or health that might indicate stress or inappropriate development." Relief flooded through Sarah. "Of course, we already maintain detailed behavioral observations. Additionally," Officer Reynolds added, "we'd like you to consider implementing a more structured educational component around Rafus's case. If you're going to maintain an arrangement this unusual, it should serve a broader educational purpose about responsible wildlife management." Tom nodded enthusiastically. "We've actually been working on a grant application for expanded educational programming. Rafus's story is powerful for teaching about the dangers of trying to keep wild animals as pets." As they finalized the details of the inspection report, Sarah noticed that even Officer Reynolds' rigid demeanor had softened slightly as she watched Rafus, now dozing peacefully on the couch as though the entire inspection had been scheduled around his nap time. When the inspection team finally departed, promising to send their formal report within the week, Sarah and Tom stood on their porch, watching the government vehicle disappear down their long driveway. "We did it," Tom said quietly, pulling Sarah close. "No," Sarah corrected him, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Rafus did it, just by being himself." Later that evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Sarah sat on the couch with a cup of tea. Rafus stretched out beside her with his head resting against her leg. Tom was across the room, putting the finishing touches on the grant application that now included specific educational components about Rafus's unique situation. "You know," Sarah said, gently stroking the bobcat's head, "when we started this sanctuary, I never imagined our most powerful ambassador would be a bobcat who thinks he's part of the family." "Home is where you're understood," Tom replied, looking up from his work. "Rafus understood that before we did." As if acknowledging the truth of this statement, Rafus stretched and repositioned himself, pressing closer against Sarah's side. Outside, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a wild bobcat might be beginning its nightly hunt. But here, in the warm light of the cabin, Rafus had found his place. Not in the wilderness where he was born, but on a couch beside the humans who had become his family. Sarah thought about all the animals they had rehabilitated and released over the years, watching them disappear back into the wild with a mixture of pride and sadness. There was beauty in that work. The triumph of returning a healed eagle to the sky, or releasing a recovered bear into the mountains. But there was another kind of beauty in Rafis's story, in finding belonging where it was least expected. As the evening stretched on, Sarah found herself thinking about Officer Reynolds' initial objection that what they were doing was unnatural. Perhaps, she reflected, the definitions of natural and unnatural weren't as clear as people like to believe. Nature created infinite variations, exceptions to every rule, adaptations to every circumstance. Rafis's ability to form deep bonds with humans might be unusual for a bobcat, but it was natural to him, as natural as breathing. The big mountain haven had been founded on the principle that every animal deserved a chance, not just at survival, but at thriving. For most, that meant returning to the wild. For Rafis, it meant a leather couch, evening television, and the unwavering love of two humans who had recognized that sometimes family transcended species. And in that recognition was the true gift, not just for Rafis, but for everyone who heard his story and understood that compassion, in whatever form it took, was never wasted. Outside, the Montana night grew cold and still, stars blazing in the vast darkness above the mountains. Inside, Rafis dozed contentedly on his couch, safe in the knowledge that he was exactly where he belonged,